Good evening again. Good morning from the West Coast. Good afternoon on the East Coast of the United States, and good evening in Europe, in London, and in Switzerland, and in Turkey, where we have our guests. I'd like to welcome you to our presentation this morning. I'm Professor Barlow Mugrdechian of the Armenian Studies program at Fresno State. This program has been one of many programs that the Armenian Studies program has been organizing over the past few years. And before we introduce today's guests and talk a little bit about today's presentation, I would like to share with you a brief PowerPoint about some of the upcoming October events of the Armenian Studies program. And I'll share the screen so that you can see those. These are upcoming events in the month of October. And we actually have a very interesting film that will be screened in the next week through Vimeo. And then on Friday, October the 1st, we're going to have a discussion with the director, Jivan Avedisian. The film is called Gate to Heaven. It deals with Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh. This is a film which is actually opening all over the United States and through Europe. So we're very lucky to be able to watch the film using the link September 25th through October 1st. And then on October 1st, we're going to have a discussion with the director. On Friday, October the 15th at 7 p.m. California time, Dr. Suren Manukyan, who is the Kazan visiting professor in Armenian Studies at Fresno State, will be giving a talk, a second in his three-part talk. It will be called Bureaucrats of the Armenian Genocide, the Mid-Level Perpetrators. Again, this is a three-part talk that he's giving. The first, which was held just last week, was on the top-level perpetrators, the architects of the Armenian genocide. You can join this through Zoom registration using the bit.ly link at the bottom of the screen, the Armenian Studies Manukyan 2. If I go through these too quickly, you can ask again for me to send you the links, but you can find these on Facebook and also at the Armenian Studies program website. On Thursday, October the 21st, our guest speaker will be Simon Mugrdechian. He's a Denver-based political scientist, human rights advocate, and investigative researcher who is spending a lot of time now researching what is happening in the lands of Nagorno-Karabakh, especially dealing with the threats to heritage. So his talk will be called Lessons from Nakhichevan, Assessing the Threat to Heritage on Thursday, October the 21st at 7 p.m. And he will be talking about the policy in the last few years and decades of erasure of cultural heritage. So that will be on Thursday, October the 21st. All of our events can be found on Facebook at the Armenian Studies Fresno State, and also at our website, fresnostate.edu/Armenian Studies. So that's a little bit about our upcoming events that will be taking place as well. Today's presentation is going to be on our newly published book, and I'm going to share the screen to let you look at the cover of the book. It's a handsome cover. Let me do that one more time. I'm going to share that with you again, the cover of this book. So the name of the book is The Committee of Union in Progress, Founders, Ideology, and Structure. It was just published just within the last month through the Armenian series of the press at California State University, Fresno. It's the 13th book in our series. And it is based on a conference that was held at Fresno State, October of 2018, which was organized by Ümit Kurt and myself. And this conference was really intended to bring new light on this very important Committee of Union in Progress, who were the party in power in Ottoman Turkey, really from 1908 until the end of the Ottoman Empire, but specifically from 1913 through World War I. And so the papers that were presented at this conference have since been edited and appear in a single volume. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And it includes the articles on the Ottoman Armenians and the Turkish nationalist movement. And they provide, I think, some new and critical insights to the Armenian genocide. The book has 5 chapters. Unable to join us today are Raymond Kevorkian, whose chapter was titled The Unionist Regime, Ideology and Command, and then another one of our contributors, Duygu Coşkuntuna, whose chapter is entitled Homeland and Nation Revisited, a discourse analysis of the memoirs of the Young Turks. She is also unable to join us. However, I'm very pleased today that we have three of the contributors to our volume that will be speaking today, and also a co-editor, Ara Sarafian. So what we're going to do is to ask each of the panelists to present and to discuss about their chapter in the book. And then at the conclusion of the three presentations, with Ara Sarafian, we're going to have a discussion and a sort of a recap of the book and some important points. And then we'll open it up to all of our participants, our Zoom participants who would like to ask questions. And you can ask questions at any time in the chat function. And then I will be posing these questions also at the end of today's presentation. Our first speaker for our presentation, our first panelist is Dr. Ümit Kurt, who contributed the very important introduction to this book, and also a chapter called The Post-Revolutionary Period in Aintab and the Curious Case of Necmettin Bey. Dr. Kurt is a historian of the late Ottoman Empire, with a particular focus on the transformation of the imperial structures and their role in constituting the Republican regime. He is a Polonsky Fellow at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute in Jerusalem and an Australian Research Council Fellow. He has just published his own new book called The Armenians of Aintab, Economics of Genocide in an Ottoman Province. So I'd like to invite Ümit to talk about his chapter in the new book.
Thank you, Professor Mugrdechian. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be with all of you and also our contributors and the co-editor, Ara Sarafian. Before talking about my chapter and also introduction of the book, just to give you certain and also a few glimpses of the content and the nature of our collective work, I would like to express my condolences on the loss of Edwin Minassian, who was a very, very active member of Armenian community, especially in the West Coast, and big supporter of our work, and also an active participant of the events and occasions in Armenian Studies program at Fresno State University. So he was really, really larger than life. So I would like to pay my respect to him as well hereby. My chapter in the book basically is about the reflections and also repercussions of the July 1908 Young Turk Revolution in Aintab, and try to explain the political and social climate in the city, how the 1908 revolution found its reflections, and how it actually ended up by focusing on a particular incident, which was a beating incident of the district governor of Necmettin Bey in the city. So in late July 1908, a telegram was dispatched from Constantinople to the post and telegram office of Aintab, and it was addressed from the Committee of Union and Progress to Aintab, and the telegram notified the citizens of Aintab that they were subject to Ottoman constitution and the empire would protect its citizens and the freedoms. Having healed from the Hamidian pogroms and plunders of 1894 and 96, Armenians in Aintab welcomed the news of 1908 Young Turk Revolution with enthusiasm, as happened in many provinces and districts of the Asia Minor in the empire. So during the summer of 1908, the CUP, as you might know, convinced the commanders of the Ottoman army in Macedonia to revolt against the Sultan Abdul Hamid and threatened to march on Istanbul unless the group's demands were met. As a result, on July 24th, 1908, the Sultan announced the restoration of the constitution and also reopened the Parliament Ottoman Assembly. And the Young Turk Revolution, of course, led to serious changes in the dynamics of power relations in different ethno-religious communities of the Ottoman Empire. So with the declaration of the second constitutional era, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation officially proclaimed itself a political power in Istanbul and joined forces with unionists and cooperated with them for the preservation and protection of the constitutional regime, and which exactly took place in Aintab as well. So everywhere in Aintab, there were parades and processions celebrating the Declaration of Freedom, and newspapers were published freely on all subjects, and all kinds of articles were written on national, local, scientific, or historical topics. So there was this utter atmosphere of freedom and its articulation. So for Armenians, a rebirth and new age had begun in the city as well. So, with the first year of the declaration of the constitution, and an important event that occurred in the city was the beating and expulsion of Aintab's kaymakam, or local prefect, Necmettin Bey. So after this incident, political institutions and organizations in Aintab were divided into constitutionalists and opponents of the constitution. So the general political atmosphere in Aintab, including social divisions and conflicts, became evident along this fault line, especially after Necmettin Bey's beating. Who was Necmettin Bey? He was from Baalbek region, and graduated from Mülkiye, and he was concerned with the security of Aintab and its surrounding villages, and personally wandered around in the evening, inspecting different areas in order to ensure the safety of the city and so forth. Yet shortly after the Young Turk Revolution, Necmettin Bey was beaten by a group of Turks and Armenians in Aintab, or Muslims and Armenians in Aintab. His clothes were torn, he was dismissed from his post, and finally expelled from the city. Unable to adapt to the new conditions of the regime, he began to oppose the new principles, had trouble in terms of recognizing the existence of constitutionalists who stood against his personal administrative authority. So Necmettin Bey was politically distant from the CUP, and he was repeatedly asked to follow up on People's Assembly meetings and elect the district's administration board. However, he always left such appeals unanswered. So, as a bureaucrat appointed to Aintab during the Sultan Abdulhamid II's reign, he insisted on rejecting the implementation of the necessary reforms, even after the constitution was declared, and there was a de facto CUP government in power. So consequently, in September 1908, local members of the CUP in Aintab gathered about 100 people who walked to the administrative building where the kaymakam had his office. And Shakir Sabri Yener, who witnessed the beating of Necmettin Bey, recalled that the main protagonists of this episode were the lawyer Ali Rıza Bey. He was an overarching unionist in the city, and Mennanzade Mustafa Bey, who came from a prominent local family. Interestingly enough, there were also Armenian groups in this gathering, in this crowd. So all the officials gather in large room, and two guards climb on the roof to observe this occupying crowd. And with his two friends, Ali Rıza Bey, who was a fervent unionist, went up to the Necmettin Bey office and delivered the demonstrators' request. Upon Necmettin Bey's refusal, Ali Rıza stepped out on the balcony and made a short speech informing the protesters of the district governor's answer. So about 10 or 15 demonstrators went upstairs and dragged the district governor down the streets and beat him, lynched him. And Ali Efendi, a gatekeeper of Emir Ali Inn in the city, grabbed him and also shoved him inside his inn and swiftly shut the gate. So, and he saved Necmettin Bey from lynching, and exposed to such humiliation, Necmettin Bey fled to Aleppo that same night. So after beating district governor, local prefect of Aintab, the people asked to visit some notables among Aintab's gentry. And they wanted a promise guaranteeing that no other officials like Necmettin Bey would be sent to Aintab again, and the constitution would be upheld. So similarly, they demanded the same guarantee from well-known and prominent Armenians of the city. So in the following days, people's excitement and fever calmed down, and gradually they start to appraise the constitution and implementation in Aintab. But this situation did not last long. In November 1908, 3 CUP officials from Istanbul arrived in Aintab to investigate this beating incident. And these officials set to work immediately, and the lawyer Ali Rıza Bey and Mustafa Mennanzadeh, who were the perpetrators of this beating event, were taken into custody, and the CUP officers launched a detailed investigation concerning Ali Rıza Bey and other 5 demonstrators. And next day, they were sent to Aleppo for trial. So, 3 of the prisoners were Turkish, like first one, Ali Rıza, and the second one, a young Hoca, Mustafa Mennanzadeh. A third one was a Muslim barber. The remaining 2 prisoners were Armenian. One of them was Georgi Barsumyan, who was a dyer, and the other was Robert Tachian, who was a tax collector. So in the meantime, the IRF administrators were working in Zeytun and Elbistan in order to form new organizational branches. Once they heard the developments in Aintab, they immediately visited the local CUP functionaries to discuss the condition of the 2 Armenian prisoners. And the CUP administrators who led the investigation were intent on punishing these men. And therefore, IRF officials were not able to get a favorable result. And after holding several meetings, they decided to take action and have their friends released. And what did they do? They drew up 3 petitions and start collecting signatures. However, most of the Muslims who had opposed the declaration of the constitution were unwilling to sign the petition. So they wanted to have the prisoners hanged, actually. And the new spirit of positive change created by the declaration of the second constitutional era and the revival of the Ottoman parliament and constitution was actually in the city was falling apart. So eventually 300 Armenians signed the petition. And in response, the verdict dispatched to Aintab concluded that the case would be repudiated and the investigation would have to be reopened, and thus leading to the return of the prisoners from Aintab to Aleppo. After remaining in prison for 10 days, the prisoners were released and taken to Aintab, thanks to efforts from the Aintab's administrative body of the CUP. Upon the news of the prisoners' return, waves of joy and happiness spread amongst their supporters. And so their arrival was celebrated with fervor and gunshots. And in the afternoon, the crowd reached the new Kaymakam's office, accompanied by the prisoners. The new district governor, replaced with Necmettin Bey, accepted the crowd's request and guaranteed that he will talk to CUP officials in order to release the prisoners on condition that 3 people watch for them, and the necessary conditions for their release were eventually met. This second demonstration, held in peace and quiet, was uneventful and unsuccessful, and those who were opposed to the constitution actually disappeared. So opponents of the constitution, who had been certain that the prisoners will be hanged, were disappointed, and the released prisoners were never summoned for investigation again. What happened to Necmettin Bey after that? Dismissed from his post in Aintab, he was appointed as the district governor of Kilis in December 1908. But the charges against him followed to Kilis as well. So because about 3 months after he took up his new post, a serious complaint was brought against him, and another post was assigned to him after Kilis, and Necmettin Bey actually was not deposed by the CUP at that time. what's interesting here is the fact that the CUP government, which overturned the Hamidian regime, revived the constitution, re-established the parliament, was not able to discharge Necmettin Bey, who was considered as representative of Abdülhamid's rule and also an opponent of unionists. Moreover, although a massive shuffling and purges were carried out among the bureaucratic rank and file of the Hamidian autocratic regime through an official law, Tensikat Kanunu, immediately aftermath of the 31st March incident, Necmettin Bey was left untouched. Despite all the complaints and inquiries concerning him, he remained at his post and continued to hold office as a district governor in other towns. Most probably, one of the reasons for this state of affairs, as the governor of Aleppo, Reshat Bey, pointed out in his telegram, was the reflex that, or the proclamation to preserve the government's authority and dignity. Even though he belonged to the bureaucratic cadres of former autocratic regime, any insult or assault on his person was taken as an attack on the central government and the state itself, as Necmettin Bey was a representative of the state and government, regardless of his political views. This fact explains why the CUP did not wish to reveal any hint of a lack of authority and government weakness, because it aimed to maintain law and order at all costs. So in order to avoid the damaging effects of such a display of weakness and a lack of authority in the public eye, Necmettin Bey, the local representative of central power and authority, continued to remain in his position. Should I maybe stop here?
I think that's good. Yes, that's a very good point to stop at. That's an overview. Gives us also something to think about as to why this was so significant in this whole development of the CUP and their policies. Thank you very much for that overview, Ümit. Our next panelist is Dr. Hans-Lukas Kieser. He contributed a chapter to the book. It's called Ziya Gökalp, Duum Wir. He is an associate professor in the School of Humanities and Social Science at the University of Newcastle in Australia, and currently an adjunct professor of history at the University of Zurich. He is an author of several monographs, including the forthcoming Violence and Ultranationalism at the End of the Ottoman Empire, In Quest of Peace and New Social Contracts in the Middle East. Dr. Kieser.
Yeah, hello, and happy to be with you on this panel. Why to give the title Duum Wir to two persons that normally are not titled this way. Normally you would think in the context of the Committee of Union of Progress, of Duumvirate of Talat Pasha and Enver Pasha, a triumvirate of Talat, Enver, Cemal, a quadrumvirate, including Halil, but not of a duumvirate. So it's not, it's a broader view, a broader approach that includes the ideological impact. So it's, it answers the question on the level of ideology and politics, who was foundational? And the answer is, my answer is the Duumvirate of Talat and Gökalp. Of course, this was a cohort of people, this was a committee, but still this committee had persons. We knew them not enough for a long time, and it's necessary to see who are, what is the profile. And so, of course, Talat is the seminal animal politique, a political animal, so in the neutral sense of the word, the executive politician, and Gökalp is clearly the most seminal ideologist, or political prophet. So this Duumvirate thesis is about impact for Turkey up to now on the level both of how politics are organized, how power is organized, and what are the main ideologies that then, who formulated them, who was most impactful in disseminate them for a hundred of years. And so my answer is Talat and Gökalp as far as the ideas are concerned. Of course, if now in the retrospect we want to add to these, we want to complete the whole view on the foundation from the 1910s to the 1913s. We of course we face a trio that includes Mustafa Kemal Atatürk as the third and in a way the ultimate person, but who himself also called Gökalp the father of his thoughts. Both work together, Talat and Gökalp, and both had an impact through persons, Talat through the cadres he formed, who almost all went directly to Ankara, and many of them very decisively also at the Conference of Lausanne. Gökalp impacted through his disciples or collaborators who came in influential positions. So this way, both by what they did and what they wrote and said, but also by the people they one may say in the headquarters of the Ittihad headquarters in Istanbul during all these years, because also journals were produced there. In this double way, they had this long-term impact. In terms of the basic ultranationalist notions, there we see an ideological continuity and coherence between Talat and Atatürk via Gökalp. And I'm not, of course, I'm not particularly original or special. There are other historical thinkers like Hamid Bozarslan or Orhan Koçak who see Gökalp's position in this particular emphasized way. So they emphasize in a way the Gökalpian constitution of post-Ottoman Turkey, that is a polity based not on a democratic consensual social contract, but on a leader-led party state and on a Turkish Islamic identity that in Gökalp's own words spared or even precluded the negotiation of a social contract because it simply was a precondition of the state, how he imagined it for the Turks. What in scholarship hitherto has lacked, I think that many would agree to say this, and what I have tried partly only, of course, to remedy with this chapter, with a similar article, already a bit in the Talat biography, is an elaborate historical approach to Gökalp's most prolific period, that is that with Talat. Not that with Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, even if he went to Ankara. So it was not only intellectual, it was then at least for nearly 2 years also a collaboration on the ground. So this prolific period has of course partly been studied through what he wrote, but not historically. So in the sense that one takes all aspects, all sources, the poems and the essays, and what he said also, what partly we have access to in memoirs or in diaries, and also what the influence he had, never a direct political executive influence, but an ideological inspiration that he very powerfully gave. So he elevated at a very critical juncture of the history of the second constitutional period, the ideal of Turan and Great Turkey. Not he alone, but he was most powerful in doing so in 1911, more in 1912, 1913. So that was this critical juncture in the Ittihad history. And then he published several very influential poems and texts. So he elevated this ideal of Turan and Great Turkey and the ideal of a Türkyurdu as a Turkish national home in Anatolia. And both was very important. Of course, Great Turkey then with the lost imperial war, lost appeal in 1918, whereas the other ideal, so-called ideal, Mefkure Ülkü, was realized according to the National Pact and then in the Lausanne Conference. As I said, he was not directly involved in the operational execution of power, but he stuck to power and to powerful men whom he sought to please and to influence. So he was not simply an instrument. And these proximity is also attested by his panegyrical poems for Talat, for Enver, for Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. So I already said that Gökalp inspired collaborators, young disciples in the Ittihadist headquarters in Istanbul, among them Necmettin Sadak, later minister, Reşit Safit Atabinen, the vice chief in Lausanne, Muhittin Birgen, Mehmet Fuad Köprülü, later also minister, Zekeriya Sertel. So all important names, intellectually especially, for post-Ottoman Turkey. Last not least, it was on Gökalp's advice that, hand in hand with the Armenian genocide, the Interior Ministry's Directorate of the Settlement of Refugees and Tribes undertook ethnographic sociological investigations in order to prepare a thorough Turkification of Anatolia. And his own concrete contribution at that point was an inquiry into Kurdish tribes. So much from my side for now, if that's fine.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kieser, for that very interesting elucidation of the relationship between Talat Pasha and Ziya Gökalp. You can read more about that in his chapter that was in the book. Our next panelist is Dr. Dikran Kaligian. He contributed a chapter which is titled "When Revolutionaries Must Govern, the Vicissitudes of ARF-CUP Relations," He is the author of Armenian Organization and Ideology under Ottoman Rule 1908 to 1914. He's been the managing editor of the Armenian Review, and his articles have appeared in multiple journals and books on Ottoman history and Armenian history. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dikran Kaligian to now present his presentation. Dikran, are you there?
Barlow,
Yes.
my video isn't coming on.
Okay, it's you're having a problem with it.
Yep.
So do you want to wait or do you and try to get going?
Is there some? It says the host. Is it the? Can you see if you can
Oh yes, let's see. Sorry. You should be able to. You should be able to do it now.
There we go.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barlow.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. Going to speak, as Barlow stated, about the ups and downs of ARF-CUP relations. And the one thing all of us, I believe, on this panel, and all of us who have dealt with the issue of the CUP, the first, when you're trying to research about the Young Turks, the first obstacle you run into is that all the official papers of the CUP at the end of World War I mysteriously or perhaps conveniently disappeared. For this reason, unlike usually when you're investigating a political party or a political movement, you don't have the internal documents, the internal debates of the organization. You have to find other sources. And so we've, what sources are used? Some, personal memoirs, personal papers of some key figures of the CUP, but you have to find other sources. The source that was available to me were the archives of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, the leading Armenian political party, and in fact, the CUP's closest ally in the Ottoman constitutional period. And so using this source, it actually allows us to see the CUP and their internal fighting and what was going on within the party from the view of the people who in fact were working closest with them and are actually analyzing what's happening. And so I try to bring this in to the discussion that I prepared for this book. And so as was pointed out, in July of 1908, you have the Ottoman Constitutional Revolution. The Constitution is restored, and many of the opposition political parties and much of the empire actually greets this with joy, that now there is a chance for all Ottomans to be treated as citizens, as opposed to subjects. And the CUP and the ARF would become key players in Ottoman constitutional politics. For the ARF to use government policies to improve conditions for the Armenians, they knew they would have to work closely with the CUP. And the first place they would work in elections, because in the end of 1908, there were parliamentary elections and a multi-ethnic parliament would be seated. The CUP immediately made deals with some of the Greek and Armenian political parties before the elections, and even allotted seats, particularly to the Jewish community, because they knew that the representation of those groups would create a real contribution to the parliament. In fact, they were depending on the expertise of the better educated non-Muslim groups to further their own program of reform and progress. This was in part because many of the Muslims who were elected to the parliament were in fact against reform, against the revolution. They were very conservative, and they knew the non-Muslim groups were pro-reform, were pro-constitution. And so as a result of these elections, 10 Armenians were elected to the parliament. 4 of them were actually members of the ARF. One was a member of the Hunchagian party. There were 2 Armenian CUP members, and Grigor Zorab, the prominent author and law professor, would play a big role. And in fact, the Armenians played a disproportionate role, given the fact they were only 10 out of 280 some odd parliamentarians. Because of their expertise, because of some of their abilities, they played a disproportionately important role within the parliament. Now, what happened in the first year was actually an improvement in security for the Armenians of the provinces of the Ottoman Empire, in part just because those who had been preying on them weren't sure what was going to happen under the new system, but in part because of actual proactive actions by the new government to punish those who would attack Armenian peasants or individuals. However, within the same first year, in this atmosphere of increasing liberties and changes and constitutionalism, an armed insurrection would break out in April of 1909 in Constantinople and would succeed in driving the CUP out of the capital. Both liberal opponents of the CUP, as Muslims opponents, as well as reactionaries and supporters of Sultan Abdul Hamid, supported this coup. And as a result of the political unrest, even though the coup did not last long and was soon put down by the military, groups took advantage of the unrest, particularly in the city of Adana and the towns and villages of Adana province, where there was not one but two separate waves of anti-Armenian massacres, in which over 25,000 Armenians perished and entire villages were destroyed. And these Adana massacres would create the first major test for ARF-CUP relations. The ARF had to decide, in the face of Armenian public opinion, whether to continue their cooperation with the CUP. And so their decision was dependent on one hand on an evaluation of just how culpable the CUP was in this, because it wasn't just the counter-revolutionaries who had committed massacres, but even the troops who came to put down the counter-revolution also participated in these massacres. So the ARF was in a serious dilemma because they were torn between solidarity with the progressive elements of the CUP and its revulsion at the murderous acts of the chauvinist elements, because the CUP was not a monolith. It had both progressive, liberal, and chauvinist conservative players within them. In the end, the ARF decides to continue cooperation based on written responses, written guarantees by the CUP, but there was already a break of faith between these two groups that had started out as allies. And so we move on from 1910 to 1911. There are attempts to actually improve, to do reforms that are actually going to directly benefit the Armenian community. But while this is happening, the CUP itself is constantly under attack, both from within and externally by European powers. And so the ARF, we read in their documents, their internal discussions, there's concern not only over the weakening of the CUP as a whole, but especially if the progressive elements within the party were actually losing control. Because ARF was fully aware of the views of the more chauvinist elements in the party and the consequences were that group to take a majority on the CUP Central Committee. So when there was, again, insufficient progress, two key ARF members, Kaligian and Varamian, from the Western Bureau, were actually sent and met for several days with the Central Committee of the CUP in Salonika. And they came to agreement that action had to be taken, that the two key issues, one was security, the ongoing security issue, but the first issue, and the preeminent one, was that the lands issue, the issue of Armenian lands had to be addressed. And the issue of land reform was in fact the critical one for a number of reasons. Because peasants comprise the overwhelming majority of the Armenian population, both the ARF and the Armenian community's most critical demand from the CUP was land restitution. That the restoration of the constitution raised hopes among the Armenians that lands could be restored to those who had been dispossessed over prior decades by more powerful forces within the provinces, and that this restitution, together with the promised equal status as Ottoman citizens, both before the law and in the eyes of the government, would allow the economic survival of the Armenian population in the historical Armenian regions. It was clear that had this loss of land, this land dispossession continued, the Armenians would not be able to continue. This was the primary hope, that this would allow the Armenians to survive economically within the Ottoman Empire, and was why there was support for the Ottoman constitutional revolution. And so the two parties agreed that the best, if not only method to settle agrarian disputes was through a joint Armenian-Turkish commission. This was because the ARF representatives were the most familiar with local conditions and the history of dispossessions in the provinces, and that only the CUP leaders would carry the authority of the government and could reassure Muslims that that they would in fact be given even-handed treatment, and it wasn't anything one-sided against them. And so for the next year, this was the primary thing that was being demanded by the ARF of the CUP. And yet the government repeatedly postponed resolution of the lands issue. Talat was their main intermediary, would not take, we read in the archives, would not take a decisive step regarding the issue, either because he chose not to or because he felt he couldn't. This may have been in part, as you know, as we read, that the Kurdish deputies and some of the Turkish deputies from, you know, actual members of parliament from the provinces were constantly pressuring the government in the opposite direction because they didn't want to lose the privileges that they had had under the prior regime. And because of this, despite over a year and a half of pursuing what was made clear from day one, was made clear when they met together in Salonika, the lands issue had to be resolved, there was very little progress made. And so because of this, the ARF World Congress that took place in 1911, in the summer of 1911, said, we have a problem here. We are sympathetic to the progressives within the CUP. We support their overall goal, but they are delivering very little. They aren't delivering on the critical issue that we're demanding of them. And so the World Congress authorized the Western Bureau, based in Constantinople, if necessary, to give an ultimatum to the CUP, and if necessary, to break off relations. Not yet, but they gave them the authority to do that should the situation not improve. And all the while this is happening, we read in the ARF's internal communication that the Western Bureau believed that the problem the CUP was facing was in fact a crisis in the parliament within the CUP, where the two wings of the CUP were actually in clashing and fighting each other. And while their sympathies were with the minority wing that in fact controlled the government for this time, they surely understood, this group was more European minded, more progressive. However, the Western Bureau was closely monitoring what was happening in this factional infighting because they knew that their only hopes for reform and constitutionalism lay with this progressive faction. And they understood and they clearly stated what the dangers were should the conservative faction actually take over. And so in this fraught situation, in this condition of concern as to what direction the CUP was moving, in early 1912, it's going to start coming to a inflection point. And this was because, the immediate test was new elections for a new parliament. And unlike the first parliamentary elections, it was not a smooth cooperation on how many Armenian members of Armenian members of parliament would be set aside for the Armenians, how many they would have to compete for, how many from this area, that area. Because the CUP felt itself weakened politically, they did not want to cede as many seats as the Armenians were demanding. And because of this, there were very fraught arguments between the ARF and the CUP, to the point where the Western Bureau reported to its Eastern Bureau, which was located in Erzurum in the provinces, that the deception shown by the CUP in the course of negotiating was beyond belief. Not just the negotiations over how many members of parliament each ethnic group would get, but in fact that even all the points that the two parties had agreed to as regarding reforms on lands and security, et cetera, that they were not delivering on that as well. And in particular, they expressed their disappointment in Talat's role in what was going on in the what they called the election deception. Now, here you might think, okay, well, this is where they said, okay, forget it. You know, this was a cut and dry case. However, interestingly, the Eastern Bureau from the provinces actually argued back and said, well, no, we understand what's going on, but don't be too quick to break things off. They're back and forth in letters. They are calling for the Bureau to keep perspective on the fact that the CUP, just the fact that they signed an agreement at the beginning of these negotiations did not mean it would be implemented right away. So it's actually interesting to see that there is no monolith even within the ARF, that those who are working closest, that are in Constantinople, are actually more pessimistic than those in the provinces that would be most vulnerable in case things broke down. And so we move into the summer of 1912. And at that time, in fact, in July, while the ARF is looking at this internal fight within the CUP is overthrown altogether by other forces, by their opposition. And the Bureau saw, the ARF saw they were in a no-win situation, because despite all the deceptions and manipulations and false promises and delays and reforms by the CUP, they were still the only party the ARF felt they could negotiate with. The others, whether they were liberal or they were conservative, the others, the opposition to the CUP, was not someone that the ARF believed was willing to negotiate and to bring progress to the Armenian community. That the CUP was in fact the lesser evil, and now they weren't even in power. And so, based on the decision that had been the year before, even though the ARF ceased their press criticism of the CUP, in August of 1912, they announced they're breaking off their cooperation, their relations with the CUP, and would act in become an opposition party within the Ottoman parliament. Because of this, the ARF then spent the next year working actually in support of the Armenian reforms that came out of the aftermath, the peace negotiations that took place in the aftermath of the Balkan War, where there was leverage by the Europeans now had the leverage to demand that the Ottoman government, with the CUP now back in power, in fact, but the Ottoman government be forced to allow reforms. European commissioners, inspectors general actually come in to improve situation within the Armenian provinces. That was their main focus, not working with the CUP because they had broken off relations. And you would think this would be the end of the story. But there would be one last case where the ARF and the CUP would sit down together, would try to work together. And that would happen in 1914. Just before the beginning of World War I. In the summer of 1914, the ARF 8th World Congress actually meets in Erzurum. And it actually has to be adjourned prematurely because World War I breaks out in Europe. However, while a number of the key delegates are still there, two representatives of the CUP Central Committee, Behadin Shakir and Omer Naji, come to negotiate with the ARF. And these meetings, which would take place over several days, are actually critical. It comes up in actually some of the genocide denial arguments that are made by a number of historians and others. Because a number of those who claim there was no Armenian genocide, including you know the names, Justin McCarthy, Kamaran Gurun, Salah Sonyel, Gunter Louis, they all deny that the CUP came and met, that there was some meeting between the ARF and the CUP in the summer of 1914. This, despite the fact that it was documented in numerous books, and I point some of this out in the article, that there were articles and books and memoirs, all from the Armenian point of view, by Armenians, that described this particular meeting. But in addition to all that, what I found in the ARF archives was actually an unpublished report, detailed, that gave much more, very detailed on what happened each day during these things, even though he was not a participant. Varamian, who sent this report to the Western Bureau, describes each day's debate, arguments that took place between the three ARFers and these two representatives of the CUP Central Committee. And so basically the CUP comes and says, well, we're going to get into World War I. We're joining the Germans because this will finally give us our chance to take on to beat the Russians and expand. And the first thing the ARF delegate says, you're crazy. The guarantee, this will be a disaster for the Ottoman Empire. Do not join the war. Stay neutral. Otherwise, otherwise you will lose your empire. Prescient, as it turned out. However, it became very clear as these negotiations continued that the decision had already been made. They were going to be signing a treaty of alliance with the German Empire. And so then the discussion came, okay, what are you Armenians going to be able to do for us? And here's the interesting thing. Where these genocide denialists, a key part of their denial is the claim that there was no genocide, that in fact, that everything that the Ottoman government and the army and the massacres and everything took place was a response to a rebellion, an armed insurrection, fifth column operation led by the ARF behind Ottoman lines. That is the crux of the denialist argument. But here's the interesting thing. Varamian writes that yes, there was discussion of a fifth column, but it was in Russia. That in fact, the main proposal by the CUP was ARF, we know you're on both sides of the border. We know you have many of your members in Russia. You in fact rose up against the Russians in 1905. Therefore, what we want to do is we're going to work together, and at a key moment, you're going to have all the Armenians in the Russian army, all your ARF members rise up and attack the Russian army from the rear. To which the ARF said, you haven't produced anything for Ottoman Armenians. Why don't you worry about that before you start looking across the border? What we're going to do is Ottoman Armenians are going to join the Ottoman army, Russian Armenians are going to join the Russian army. And that's the only way that the Armenians are going to have a chance to survive, because otherwise you're going to be seen as traitors, despite the fact this might result in brothers having to fight each other on the battlefield. And that before you promise autonomy to the Armenians of the Caucasus, you need to produce it for the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire. This is all documented in Varamian's report. And so this is, ironic, if not very clear, that the only fifth column that was being proposed, that, the reason why the genocide denialists claim that there was no meeting between the ARF and the CUP is they would have to somehow explain what were they talking about for 3 or 4 days. And they would have to somehow respond to this claim that it was the only fifth column being discussed. You're asking supposedly someone who was creating a revolution against you to do the same against the Russians. So what is clear then from the documentary record is that the CUP had unsuccessfully attempted to recruit the ARF into organizing Russian Armenians to form a fifth column behind Russian lines. And this is the last act of ARF and CUP cooperation. And we know what comes after that, World War I. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kaligian, for that presentation. His chapter, again, on the vicissitudes of that relationship between the ARF and the CUP. This time, I'm going to invite Ara Sarafian. He's the director of the London-based Gomidas Institute to give a sort of summary of our presentation and maybe some questions and things that people can be thinking about. He, along with Ümit Kurt, are the two co-editors of the book, along with myself, but I want to express my thanks to both Ara and to Ümit, because without them, the book would not have been published. So thank you, Ara, for that, and also to Ümit. So I'm going to hand it over to Ara to make some comments, and then I'll be adding everyone to the spotlight, all of our speakers, and then we'll have this little discussion as well. So Ara Sarafian. Ara, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Barlow. I just made loads and loads of notes as you guys were speaking, and very, very thought-provoking. Thank you for the contributors. Thank you to Barlow and Ümit. I came into the process of this volume and the previous volume as well. Barlow didn't mention Armenians and Kurds in the late Ottoman Empire, more as an editor, as a secondary stage. So my comments are from that perspective. And I'd like to make some in-house comments because what Fresno is doing in this particular volume is a very good indication. You know, CUP, founders' ideology and structure, is the fact that the word Armenian is not even in the title. It is actually a fresh or a healthy approach to modern Armenian historiography or Armenian studies that is much more inclusive of the broader context in which Armenian history exists, right? So in that sense, it's a break, and the papers that we had for this paper reflect that and reflect the different types of material that the volume has brought in together. As a sort of ardent Armenian historian myself, and I do call myself an Armenian historian, although I deal with broader issues, is that what is Armenian studies? What is Armenian history? And I actually define that in terms of the history in which the Armenians themselves are agents of themselves. And in this paper, we have several papers that are directly related to that approach. I mean, Dikran's is probably the best example, Raman Kevorkian too. It's based on Armenian archives, based on an Armenian agenda, their understanding. It reflects the life and concerns and the interests and the agenda of the Armenians as historical actors, and of course, the Armenian community. It's at the core, and it's vitally important. Then we have Ümit's paper. Ümit is a new generation of a scholar. He happens to be Turkish, is secondary, but it shows you how far we have come in Armenian studies. He's very much part of our team, and he brings in his own forte as someone who knows Armenian and Turkish and who draws on different types of sources. And in many ways, Ümit, I'm not sure whether I would say you're in the core or not, but in a sense, you are also in the core. And you, in this case, you did in your paper, you have presented a case study that cuts across so many different issues of that period, of the CUP Armenians, all those ambiguities, all those questions, things that we think we understand in a more traditional veins, and we don't. And those questions are already the beginning of more approaches, more this type of case studies that in some ways enlightens us. It depends from where we're coming. Then, of course, we have a Dr. Kieser's paper. He's a senior mainstream scholar, yet he's bringing his expertise, in this case, Talat and Gökalp and ideology. It's technically in a contextual framework of a modern Armenian history, but of course, the context is very much part of the core. And so a book like this is breaking down those distinctions. It's broadening our Armenian studies. Hopefully, we'll have more and more of this type of debates within our core community, whether it's an Armenian studies program or the immediate readership whose starting point is within so-called Armenian traditional Armenian works. So I think this volume and the one earlier is important in terms of approach and the direction in which you are going. You are a trailblazer because you are reconfiguring, reformatting Armenian studies the way we understand it. And I hope it continues. This doesn't mean that, there are very interesting individual papers. Of course, there are issues. There are issues with all papers. That's the very nature of academia and scholarship. But this is certainly the way forward. One of the issues that again Dikran touched on, but I guess you all touch on, is he took his presentation all the way to the sort of denial process, and he said, well, can we avoid that? Why do we even need to talk about it when we can talk of our own material? But the denial process is part of the problem, because the work that we are doing not only has academic merit or historiographical significance, but it also has a political significance. We are operating in a political context. There is denialist historiography, separate from poor historiography, which is something different. It's also there. There are active schools of thought that are reproducing this material. One of the discussions that we could have is whether they matter on the long run at all. Maybe we should ignore it, and for the sheer force of the type of scholarship that we are bringing together in such conferences and in such publications, in some ways you are leaving them by the wayside. Is that the case, or is it the case that we are in some ways put in our own little pocket, but the mainstream will still remain there? The mainstream Turkish historiography supported by the state, based on prejudice analyses, misstatements, stereotypes, falsehood, will they win on the long run? So how does broader academia work, and can we challenge them to create, or as we are creating, a new sort of middle ground of Ottoman historiography that is inclusive of these various elements, and inclusive in a critical way, in the interest of scholarship, and also in the interest of better understanding of our respective histories as people of that region, but also in a broader context. So I'd like to congratulate, first, thank you again for all the participants. I think all your papers are extremely important. But I would like to end by stressing the context in which this is happening and the direction, the force with which it is going forward. And I understand that these type of conferences will continue going forward. And what I like to see is more people participate, more papers, because there's so much more to say. And I'd like to see more Armenian participants, to be very blunt about it. When you know the source materials that we have at our disposal, and how poorly it is used, how much of it simply is not accessed. And you know what, the Armenian material doesn't always stack up in one direction. It is possible to have these critical debates, even within that context. But this is all part of this broadening out into a new type of legitimate scholarship that will break down barriers, that will in some ways depoliticize the subject matter itself in the interest of, shall we say, a more peaceful understanding of history itself. So I'd like to stop there. We can comment on individual papers, but we can also talk about this broader context and how we may add on to it, perhaps even for future conferences as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ara, for that those comments, because it is important to put this work in the context of the field of the study, and to bring up those questions which are still open to question, and to bring these different perspectives. I just wanted to mention again my thanks to Dr. Ümit Kurt, who was the co-organizer of the original conference in 2018. It's been actually, we've worked on 3 conferences together, and it's been a pleasure to work on them and to plan these for the future as well, to continue, as Ara said, this sort of bringing together of scholars from a variety of disciplines to look at these questions. Now, we just have a few minutes left. If anyone in our audience would like to write a brief question or comment, really a question, in the chat area, they can do so. In the meanwhile, I'll just open it up again. If Dr. Kieser or Dr. Ümit or Dr. Kurt or Dr. Kaligian would like to say a brief comment in conclusion, or maybe a brief question, we can do that before we conclude our presentation today. Maybe I'll start with you, Ümit, if you have a response to Ara's comments or to any of the other 2 panelists. I think you're on mute, so yeah.
Unmute.
Yeah, you're okay. Yeah,
you're fine. Okay, you hear me,
you
guys? Okay, okay, perfect. Yeah. So actually, CUP like has been maybe considered as like a bogeyman, in the field. So what we are talking about is an important political entity, not only the author of the Armenian genocide or the deportation or the collective massacres of an Ottoman, citizens in certain time period, but we are also talking about, in the first place, an intellectual organization, which turned into a political one, and then radicalized itself to the, to the end of it. So I think we need more studies on elucidating the CUP as an institution, as a party, as a committee, its ideological tenets, which are still quite influential in modern Turkish politics. I'm not only talking about this conventional and cliche argumentation of ruptures and continuity, but what I'm talking about is its reflection, its influences, its legacy, the CUP's legacy, which I believe the first and foremost, like a Turkish trademark political tendency, like a political attitude, as not only an ideology or a worldview. And so in order to understand this entity, I think we need more works, particularly biographical ones, prosopographical studies as well, the internal, and we need more studies on the internal dynamics of the CUP, its procedures, its operations, of the committee and the party itself. So differences between the party and the committee. And still we have not, there's another understudied area which is related to decision-making mechanisms in the CUP, how they make decisions, not only in high politics, but also in low politics and or other aspects and walks of political life as well. And of course, still its organizational structure in Macedonia, like in Albania, still begs for exploration, and we also need more local studies, more micro level studies to understand and how the CUP organized in the periphery in various Anatolian provinces, and also I think we need. I know that Professor Kaligian's work is a pioneering one in that sense, but we also need more works on the similarities and the differences between the organizational structure of the CUP and that of IRF, Hınçaks, even Ramgavar. So that's why we need more comparative analysis in this sense. And I believe this existing volume makes such an invitation for further research to the scholars.
Dr. Kieser, would you like to make any brief response or brief comments as well to either Ara's comments or anything at all? If not, it's okay too. I think you're on mute also. So
yeah, also I can simply underline what Ümit just said, and perhaps add that to my mind, a very important point is, and in fact it has been said, is to bring in the Armenian sources and the Armenian agencies, and to thus to complete a multifaceted but still profiled picture of this time. So I would so love to be able to read the Armenian sources, and I am sure there is a lot, not perhaps the ultimate source, but a lot that can help to elucidate particular moments, or simply to see that angle, to take it fully into account. I think that's something that is still to be done. And as Ara said, it's now within an opened field, and that is necessary, that is promising, and that is absolutely unavoidable to do it this way.
Thank you.
I just see in the chat there is a question that is possibly addressed to me. Shall I answer?
Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
To my knowledge, Mehmet Zia Gökalp did not write explicitly against the Armenians, no hate speech or hate propaganda. But he wrote other very important, heavy things. For example, that little nations do not have the right to survive, and that dissenting ideas must be killed. So he said it, he wrote this in 1917 or early 18, after the genocide, after so much killing. So killing ideas is killing also humans. So what I want to say is, sorry, that was what I want to say is no explicit direct hate speech or anti-Armenianist explicit vocabulary, but a lot of other critical ideologies that fully supported the agencies that were massively anti-Armenian, or Talat, to point to the most important figure in this context. Yeah,
Thank you
so much.
Thank you. And Dr. Kaligan, do you have a final comment as well?
Sure. First, I'd like to thank Ara for his comments, and I agree wholeheartedly that there is an opportunity here to fill the void where there hasn't been much written about the CUP. And I think it's important for honest scholars to actually help write the history, since because otherwise, who knows what will end up filling the void. And so that's why I'm grateful to Fresno State as well for having not just organized the conference, but also published this book. Secondly, I think Ümit's point is also very important as far as the local history. So much of what has been written about the Ottoman Empire and what has been written about the CUP is all in Constantinople. It's all in the capital. And as we know, this of course is a problem in all histories. I mean, in German history, Lord knows that's a problem. But the need to actually show what's happening throughout the provinces, throughout the empire, and not just concentrate on the macro level, but rather the micro level. So your work, Ümit, is very important. Eintub. I was able to do some of that in showing what in some of the reports that were coming, whether it's from Erzurum or it's from Urfa or it's from Van or from Mush. This is, I think, very important because not only is it broadening the history, but in fact, there probably is nothing to contradict it. The Armenian sources in these areas, besides maybe British consular sources, there probably is very little else that will ever be found that can actually describe what was happening in each of these localities. So the more that we write about that, the more that we cover the micro level, I think this will also help fill in many of the gaps. And that's why I'm very happy that we were able to bring this all together.
Thank you, everyone. I would like to thank our panelists, Dr. Ümit Kurt, Dr. Hans-Lukas Kieser, Dr. Dikran Kaligian, our discussant, Ara Sarafian. We wish we had more time to discuss all of these, but I think we've at least brought up some of the issues that are presented in this new book called The Committee of Union in Progress, Founders, Ideology, and Structures. I did place in the chat where you can read more about these, or if you're interested in purchasing the book. Thank you for joining us again from the Armenian Studies program. We'll see you for our next events, and we'll see you all soon at